It is May 8th, 2023. Fresh off the heels of May Day, the Monday prior, followed up with Karl Marx's birthday on May 5th, and the following day, the birthday of Maximilien Robespierre on May 6th. A belated salute to the birth of these giants who fought to give ground to the people. I'm Marwan.
I'm Devin.
I'm Phoenix.
Welcome to the Wasteland and the Mountain, where we discuss the state of the left, analyze where it's gone awry, and together envision a path forward from the wasteland and towards the mountain. In our prior inaugural episode, we began to paint a picture of not only the aim of our podcast, broadly speaking, but also spoke towards the points and the politics that guide us. We spoke to the need to reestablish the left firmly in class consciousness. We spoke generally to the low state of functional power on the left and also to the catastrophic threat to left political power from liberalism. We touched upon the connection of liberalism to postmodernism. We talked about the fragmentation and the atomization that is found not only everywhere in society but also on the left. How this atomization is no happenstance or accident, but indeed an intended effect supported by the ruling hegemony. Today, we intend to continue painting a picture of our politics obliquely through discussing more concepts and matters. So, we begin with a question. Many on the left in the US have a profound distrust of authority, ranging from cynicism about expertise and authorities on matters of knowledge and capability, but also to institutions. Where does this come from, and how does it relate and extend itself on the left? Phoenix, if you'd like to go ahead and take this one.
Sure. Well, I think that there's several factors at play here with regards to this. First and foremost, there's this postmodern neoliberal ideology that's all about relativism. And that basically means that all paths, all truths are considered equal no matter what. And there's basically no one right way to do anything. And that can lead to a lot of cynicism towards people like experts and institutions, and a lack of trust in established authority at that. And another factor, I think, is America's puritanical history. And that led basically to a reaction against authority because the beatniks and the hippies, pushed for total social liberalism, and liberty became synonymous with anti-authoritarianism. If you think about, the kind of culture previous generations here dealt with, that was the era of, Jim Crow laws, anti-sodomy laws, anti-miscegenation laws, child labor, prohibition, right? So coming from this highly conservative society, there was this anti-authoritarianism that marked the left. I think generally also you have in the American psyche, you have this mythologized idea of freedom, where to be free is kind of a laissez-faire version of just being free from interference. Any regulation attempt is basically seen as a threat to individual liberties, right? And I think this contributes to a deep-seated skepticism of authority in the American psyche. It's based on the American mythology. And then I think also finally in late 20th century, you have this memory of the rise of authoritarian movements outside the liberal West that were indeed genocidal and very inefficient and brutal in many horrible ways, reminiscent of 1984. And I think seeing that led to a kind of nihilism and a last man culture because they retreated from all of that, all of positive liberty, and basically threw the baby out with the bathwater. Now they just retreated away from any kind of authority at all, and just consumerism became the new god. So I just think it's important to recognize that authority isn't always bad, and we need to value expertise and anti-corruption, and it's based on good experience and virtuous leaders. And in that case, authority is a very good thing if the hierarchy is well established to accomplish those goals for society in a positive way. Otherwise, we have to be careful, and that's the game.
Yeah, excellent thoughts, Phoenix. You touched upon a lot. Devin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that was a very comprehensive overview of the West's distrust of authority and or mistrust of authority. I think we can kind of break it down in terms of like the religious and the secular. In terms of religion, like you mentioned, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was, of course, like the main. Um, it was like just the main hegemony of the West for you know thousands of years. So it really grounded the West, and it kind of gave us our like sense of meaning and purpose as a culture. And then, of course, with the rise of Protestantism, it broke down the authority of the Catholic Church, and it sort of created like religious anarchism in the West. And that's there's been all sorts of offshoots of that have sort of deteriorated just I guess a religious authority. But then on the secular side, you have postmodernism, which is it's the ideological distrust of grand narratives in general too. And this is of course this comes from a secular, more academic standpoint. But yeah, I mean it's all about deconstructing grand narratives and like just general ideological frameworks for interpreting the world. And yeah, it's just created just ideological anarchism in our society, and there's really no glue or cohesion to anything any longer. And this has affected the left, and it's just affected like our society in general, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that, gentlemen. I think you've both really hit the nail on the head. And my answer is really similar. I mean, I think, the United States, as we know, is a deeply Protestant nation culturally, and therefore it's very Protestant in its outlook. And I think um, Protestantism, or like this pathological distrust of authority, is like almost this existential, kind of instinctual kind of mode, and it really kind of comes from these cultural realities. And of course, there are other reasons. There's pervasive mistrust of authority, and it comes from actually pretty valid fucking places. Like, I mean, if you look at politicians and figures of state, whether local or national, from the police to your local town hall to like the CIA, like widespread news of national intelligence agencies over the decades overthrowing democratically elected governments around the world, and especially in South America, to stories about police abuse, especially as it pertains overwhelmingly to like the black population in the United States. Headlines about shameless like cronyism and nepotism, like all these things taken together validate and justify the narratives that one's kind of deep and profound cynicism and lack of social trust and kind of instinct to ensure that you've got your bread secured and damn everyone else is a very rational kind of perspective. I mean, politicians, as we know, they come into office making very big promises. They're stage managed. They rarely speak like normal people do, and they break their word in constant ways. Um, and it's just deeply unrelatable. And their loyalty to narrow interest is often barely disguised. Especially in the last 2 decades, it's just gotten worse, especially with Trumpism. Um, Okay, we'll move on to the next question. How might conceptions of the nature of freedom impel people towards solidarity or move them away from it? Well, for me, solidarity depends entirely on conceiving of freedom socially and like in the fight with peers or the other. In other words, the other, like philosophically, the other, on the notion that like all who labor deserve the fruits of their labor, that in struggle with others we can find justice and our just deserts. Counterpose that with like the freedom to be left alone, so to speak, to tinker alone, to entreat yourself on an island, is like that's a freedom that many people in the United States are fooled by. And I think that goes right back to, you know, not only just neoliberalism, but Protestantism in many ways too. Like people really think that, like the people on the right, like libertarians always say, like, um, freedom comes at the barrel of a gun, you know? And so the kind of implication from that is that if you're alone, if you don't have a barrel of a gun trained on you, that you're free, right? Like you can starve in the jungle alone with no clothes on your back, but if nobody's got a fucking gun pointed at you, you're free. And this like this like freedom in the jungle is like it's just kind of laughable in some real ways, but the freedom to starve and the freedom um like that kind of freedom, it's not a freedom at all, but again, bizarrely, many people conceive it as freedom in precisely that way. Left libertarians are often content to operate like a workers' co-op, um, and that's its own kind of island of sorts. It's not really like it's not really tied in with like a unionist movement. Like you don't join like a national union where people who do similar work for you like increase their power, increase their ability to represent themselves like nationally, and who can like intervene in a coordinated and centralized way. Like left libertarians are often kind of like they might be down with that in theory, but in practice they hardly take serious steps towards stuff like that. They're content to just function in co-ops, and that's kind of, again, it's its own kind of freedom in an island kind of mentality. Like I'm gonna like live my very narrow like lifestyle radicalism, and wear tight pants and docks and listen to like post punk, and and then that's good enough for me. And I just think that's really limited. So that's my take on that question.
Yeah, I mean it's just a ridiculous position. It's like people view themselves as these islands, like you said. Like they don't think of themselves as being a part of a society. Like, and the reason that they are the people who they are, and the reason that they have the ability and the capabilities to do the things that they can do is because they were raised in a society with like social structures and yeah, they're not on a desert island by themselves. Like people don't realize that having a state and like a coherent society is what allows you to flourish as a human being. Like without it, you're nothing, And I think people take that for granted a lot.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The key is I think in a word I think is very powerful, which is synergy, right? The total is
Love that
greater than
word.
the sum of its parts, right? And that's where freedom comes in, because what freedom is in terms of human society is the additional value that is brought in synergistically that goes above and beyond the sum of its parts. That's the leverage that society brings to individuals in order to achieve uh, a higher level of freedom.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and so far, it's like all of our institutions that we've created so far as a species have not created any sort of optimal synergy. Like it's created in general just a really dysfunctional population, and uh, it's a very big problem. But that's why we need to have a new society that allows for this sort of optimal synergy, because it's like we need to have we've had all sorts of we've tried literally every sort of horrible system, and it doesn't mean that we can't have it doesn't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it just means that we just need new institutions that can allow human flourishing, and we just haven't had that.
Yeah, well, Marwan, when he first expressed the question, it was regarding conceptions of the nature of freedom, implying that there's different ways that people can conceive of what freedom is, which is one of the biggest questions ever. And I think people of very different ideological bends can both say that what they're doing is for freedom, and yet they might believe in the exact opposite of somebody else that says the same thing. So, what's going on there? Um, so it's the nature between the collective and the individual, to be free from any external interference versus to be free from not having to be eaten at night in the jungle because you have protection from the community, right? So the childish notion of just leave me alone and laissez-faire ideas of freedom is ultimately going to be untenable because of the biggest challenges of our time that are coming, which will require incredible amounts of coordination and leadership capability. So just dialectically, that will have to emerge to rise to the occasion. But the ultimate freedom then, though, is a psychological one. It's the freedom of the individual who, in any given situation, has a sense of self, a sense of well being, a sense of clarity, a sense of the ability to exercise their reason and their autonomy. And they are cultivated by their society to think in wise manners of thinking. Those who are inculcated with that mode of thinking are the ones that are the most free in the economic sense at the highest level. Excuse me, they're the most free at the political level, at the highest level, because a society of self-actualized minds is the most free society possible.
Yeah, yeah, I think the concept of like self-actualized minds, or it's kind of interesting because like from a romantic level, a lot of the kind of subcultural scenes that kind of entreat people to this idea that they're finding their real freedom by being like left alone to just live their life or something. They they they, I grew up in Portland, Oregon. Yeah, I went to punk shows, through my teen years and through my 20s, and even today I still go to the occasional punk show, admittedly not as much. And anarchism is a huge, it's hugely valued. Like a lot of people who go to those, like they believe in autonomy, the principle of autonomy. And actually that was the most appealing concept, even as a young like anarchist. I was an anarchist in my youth. um I was misguided. I was, it was a mistake nevertheless, but that's where I was. I'm not ashamed of it. It's just, that's just where I come from. But there was a lot of things that were appealing to me, and this notion of like being, my parents always told me to think for myself growing up, and that was a huge value in that scene. And a lot of like left anarchists really have that value. And I actually think that's fucking awesome. But eventually I realized that this kind of notion to like dare to think, to be daring in thought is like, there's a lot of lip service paid to that, but a lot of people I was meeting, I was like, without even kind of noting it, without even realizing it, it was occurring to me that these were like like radical liberals who really engaged in a lot of groupthink and were like really other directed and did not think for themselves. um, and so there was a kind of irony that was kind of, there was a lot of tension from that irony. But nevertheless, the notion of like being an autonomous person is frankly still a notion I still value in the extreme, even though again I don't consider myself an anarchist. I think that's a good instinct, and like, this notion of DIY, do it yourself, become more capable, become more well-rounded, figure out how to do things. That's like a good and healthy kind of instinct. I think it can be taken to an extreme. I don't think it's a replacement for, social institutions that have your back, that where you can go and get educated without, having to get an inscrutable and life altering debt. I think free education should be free and easily accessible. I think that actually is critical and important to any movement. But nevertheless, like these are the things that enable you to really think and to achieve freedom in a higher sense, in a more positive sense.
Well, and to leverage up your statement on education, I mean, not only should education be free, but education should be so designed to achieve that outcome of the self-actualized mind on mass, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Using education as a tool for collective, um, mass collective consciousness increasing. Um, So that's fundamentally woven into theories of politics and even economics and how all the pieces combine to conceive of a left wing that does what it does to improve the human condition at a sociocultural level and at a sublime level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, excellent thoughts, gentlemen. Any final thoughts on that before we move on to the next jumping off point? Okay. Well, um, liberals often view themselves as stalwart supporters of the downtrodden, even going as far as speaking on behalf of or claiming to voice the concerns of the disaffected, the marginalized, the oppressed. Sometimes, when doing so, making quite patronizing, racist, or very ignorant remarks in their eagerness to champion the marginalized. In this way, liberalism reveals itself as reactionary. How do matters of class cleave against the grain of division and identity based distrust? How does this often good faith instinct to raise up the voices of the marginalized get better served? Phoenix, I think you had thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so the left instinctually wants to support the downtrodden, right? It's what defines it by definition. But sometimes what happens is or what's happened culturally is the instinct to almost elevate the act of being downtrodden to a virtue in and of itself, as opposed to simply something that systemically needs to be solved, right? Because when we're dealing with that culturally, um, it we've seen a big trend towards virtue signaling, towards superficial displays of quote unquote solidarity, of woke the woke Olympics, as it's been called, right? Of how many oppression points can you accumulate to gain, favorability or gain clout. All of that is a distraction from what are the systemic roots of the oppression that we're dealing with economically and even culturally. So that's I think a big a challenge for the left right now is culturally shifting their mentality from victimhood as a virtue to being more solution oriented on systemic shifts that lead to that in the first place, so that you don't have to have any victims anymore at all, rather than praising them for that status of victimhood itself.
Yeah, yeah, interesting thoughts, Phoenix. I think I agree with the gist of. I might phrase things a little differently, but nevertheless, I think there's. It's no doubt that um, there's like that, like left liberals use categories of like marginalized identities in kind of cynical and self-serving ways. Like I think like a lot of um, white liberals will just like hedge all their all their energy on like the most marginalized, like almost mythological, like, disabled, trans, black women facing misogynoir. Like the categories get narrower and narrower and narrower, and it's like they hedge their clout on like being like the voice of these people. And
Well, it's interesting. This is a psychological thing at play, right?
yeah,
It's like what's going on deep subconsciously that it's making somebody proud to try to add on as many as possible because you're perceiving that as having points. It's a misguided perception.
it is. It is in many ways. Yeah, absolutely. And it's also very patronizing and dehumanizing. And it
Right.
reminds me of this really popular book that kind of made its rounds in like 2020 in the outbreak of like the George Floyd protests, which were incredible and fraught in many ways, but nevertheless like an exciting time that like White Fragility was just flying off the shelves by Robin DiAngelo. And that book is just fucking terrible. I mean, we're not gonna spend time analyzing it here, but that's like a really good example of exactly what this question gets to the heart of. And honestly, I don't think um, that sort of dynamic is really where real solidarity lies. I think it's so much easier for the universalism of the human condition to be front and centered. I fully believe that it's an important and valuable thing for people to be aware of what the experience, of marginalized peoples is. There's nothing wrong with educating yourself with that. That's always a good thing. But front loading marginality, uh, as a way of saying that this person has more value to speak from, as a category of their identity, it is disempowering to everybody. It
Yeah.
really blunts everybody's ability to speak as a human being, as an intelligent person in solidarity with other people.
It ironically increases the psychological incentive to identify as a victim in one way or another because it's
Yeah.
perceived to be a source of power.
Yeah. I mean, I think recognizing one's like victimhood is like good in as much as you realize that you're like oppressed by the ruling class, that you're victimized by the extremely poor, backwards, and absurd ways that society is run, and how it doesn't serve people's interests writ large, and I mean working people's interests. You know, yeah. Any more thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to postmodernism in a lot of ways, and like a general distrust of authority, which is what we've touched on already, but distrust of authority and just a distrust of any sort of hierarchy or like any sort of absolutes. Like postmodernism really it's attempted to destroy any sort of absolute, especially like any sort of like absolute identity. It's all it's about relative identity and difference. Like there's no such thing as like categories aren't fixed. Everything is in flow, um, and it's all about like contingent relations between people and the societies they find themselves in, and so on and so on. Um, so it's like yeah, it's just these ideas have spawned this idea, or this general conception that like everything is just fragmented and atomized, and you could just have identities like to infinity. A lot of this boils down to recognition, and this is something that like Hegel talks a lot about, which is something that we'll probably eventually get into, like Hegel's theory of recognition. But it's like people are looking for recognition for themselves as an identity and as a people. But the point is that it can't be achieved through like disunity and through like this like disaggregation. Like the only way that can be achieved is through, um, is through unity and like a strong state and a strong society.
Yeah.
Go back to 2011. What was the last major leftist movement we had before Bernie Sanders in the United States? To any degree, was Occupy with 99%. Now that's almost everybody. Now you had the third estate, which was a small percent of society. You had Ayn Rand and so on talk about the individual as the fundamental unit of society, right? These are all fractures of the totality. It's not the nine. None of these are the 99%. They're pieces of it, which is what make them reactionary, because it's about how that piece gets advantageous, benefits over the rest. Well, so in even woke discourse, that's also breaking down what percentage of the people are LGBTQ, what percentage of the people are all these other subcategories, and the more you fracture what each person's sense of liberation entails, then that's how much you're fracturing the 99%, right? So that's what makes that reactionary, because you're actually bringing people's consciousness away from the unifying factor.
Yeah, yeah, like the unifying element that class serves is really critical, and I think I think postmodernism kind of discards that and dismisses it as a meta narrative that, doesn't, that they would say doesn't hold water anymore. And by by sacralizing nuance, and what we're doing is like sacralizing the every narrow category of identity that can possibly be conceived, and then people turn that narrow category of identity as a political end in and of itself. And there's no
Right.
there's no there's nothing there. You can't make them ends in themselves. They're not universals. You need universals to make political ends. And so it's a dead end. I think it's a dead end. And that's something we definitely seek to analyze more. But if we have more thoughts to say to that, we can make those comments now, or I'll leave to the last jumping off point.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up one other thing. Like you said, like it's a complete dead end. And the thing is that the ruling elite know that. Like there's this really interesting declassified document from the CIA. Um, and it's called France Defection of the Leftist Intellectuals. And I believed it was, if I'm not mistaken, I believed it was released or it was written in 1985. But it was basically examining the French, what they called the New Left intellectuals at the time, like Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Guattari, and there's some other ones I'm not naming, but basically like just the New Left intellectuals at the time, and what they came to the conclusion of. And by the way, like by New Left intellectuals, I mean like all these thinkers are generally in the broad category of postmodernism. But what this what this document reveals is that they were following these guys, and they were following their work. And what they came to the conclusion of in this document is that like these new left thinkers were actually perfect. Like they didn't consider it a threat. Basically, like they thought it was perfect to even promote this sort of stuff and not try to censor it or not try to discredit it in any way, because it disunified the left, and all it did was cause infighting, and it took emphasis away from like like traditional like Marxist class politics into this realm of like identity. um, and there's a quote here. It says, this new left activism is likely to increase bickering between leftist parties and within the Socialist Party, and it will probably increase voter defection from both socialist and communist camps. So it's like the ruling elite, like they love postmodernism, like they love these ideas because all it's done is just sow discord on the left,
It makes better
and that's
consumers.
why I mean, and it makes better consumers. Like that's right, which is a whole other that's a whole other topic that we'll eventually have to we'll get into, especially I think when we get into the Center of the Self by Adam Curtis. But yeah, I mean these ideas are gladly embraced by the ruling elite because it just sows discord.
Really well said. Yeah, I mean, like who benefits? Who benefits from this? It's the ruling elite. It doesn't really take. It's not that difficult to see. I remember, like, when I was getting kind of into the DSA in 2017, and thinking, okay, like, I don't know where the left is going, but this looks promising. Let's give it a shot. I learned a lot. I don't regret it in any way. But I remember like going to some of our general meetings locally, um, in the DSA, and then just seeing these like really smug, self-important people. Like there's this one guy, he's like half black. He actually comes from a really rich family. It was like one of the first time he comes to a general meeting, and he just immediately points out that, oh, there's a lot of white people in the room. As if, like, everybody there needs to feel ashamed, and like, and it immediately takes people off the focus of like what good, important, solidaristic kind of work can we get in on, and it's just immediately like, well, I'm gonna like use everybody's guilt as a stepping stone for people to like listen to me. And that kind of dynamic is like so pervasive, and it is divisive. It's absolutely divisive. And then frankly, I'm sick of people pretending it's
and
not. It's just it's
and
so
that will
divisive.
cause a reactionary backlash. That's just unavoidable.
Yeah, I mean, like socially, it absolutely has. I mean, um, I think Trump's success is a testament to that in some way, and yeah, it's a difficult position. Like this kind of liberalism doesn't serve the left. It does not serve the left at all. Okay, well, gentlemen, really good thoughts there. We'll move on to our last jumping off point before we kind of end our episode here. And this is a big topic, but I figured this is something that we'll be touching upon more and more, so we don't have to go too deep. But people often assume the left is completely atheistic. Is that a fact? How might spiritual left movements find themselves closer to a more comprehensive vision of left politics than those who shirk any notion of religion or the sacred? Devin, I think you had thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts for the first part of the question. Like people often assume the left is completely atheistic. Is this a fact? Um, and really, I mean, the atheistic left is actually a modern phenomenon, and it ties into like the broad historical currents of the West in general. That's moved towards science and like secularization. But like from our current modern standpoint, I think it's easy to forget that religion and spirituality has largely been a driving force in all human enterprise. Um, so, like for instance, like if we look at ancient working class liberation movements like the slave revolt led by Spartacus in ancient Rome, Spartacus's wife uh, was a devotee of the Roman god Liber, which is where we get the term liberty, and Liber was the Roman equivalent of the Greek Dionysus, and she considered her husband to be an incarnation of Dionysus Liber, which is like one of Dionysus's um, uh, uh, guises, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And like Spartacus was no doubt inspired by the liberating nature of the mysteries of Dionysus. Like he was involved with the Dionysian mysteries and all that Dionysus implies as like a concept and like an archetype, just of liberation in general. So yeah, I mean, just this idea that like the left is atheistic is it's just flat out false. Like historically, it's just not true. It's like left impulses always it, come from a religious and like spiritual um, jumping off point. And like of course you have like left religious political movements in the Middle Ages, like Christian Gnostic sects, like the heresy of the free spirit. You have the precursor to the Jacobin clubs in France, like the Alumbrados, which believed in the ability of like the higher self to unite with God, and that caused a major stir, like amongst the Catholic Church and the political establishment at the time. So yeah, I mean, the left and spirituality have always had a very intimate relationship, and I think it's just a mistake to assume that the left is atheistic.
Yeah. Yeah, really well said. Nevertheless, I think that concept is a kind of pervasive one, and I think you're absolutely right that it's not factual. Um, but more than it just not being factual, um, on the question of like how might spiritual or left movements find themselves like closer to a more comprehensive vision, I think it's by positively approaching the question and the value that so many place in um, higher meaning, so to speak. I think when people hear scientific socialism or historical materialism, I think there's like this, a la Marxism. I think there's this kind of like tendency to um, interpret that in this like overly scientific kind of manner, where the assertion is that like any notion of spirituality or the divine is absurd and false and should not be taken seriously, and is something that we need to like that is de facto reactionary and that needs to be overcome. You know, I think there have been kind of perspectives like that in various currents. Um, but I think it's a mistaken one, you know. I mean, we look at like Martin Luther King and the um, social gospel movement of Walter, you know, Reuschenbach. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. We look at like some of the Catholic kind of left wing, movements in South America. Their names of which elude me, unfortunately. But nevertheless, like there is clearly a history of this, and of course, Devin, you pointed out to a lot of ancient and more recent ones like prior to Marxism. Totally valid, absolutely. But for me, like the other part is, and I think Phoenix referred to this in our inaugural episode. It's about looking like at all of the rungs of Maslow's hierarchy, from the material needs to the kind of needs of meaning. I think people are meaning machines, you know, and I don't mean machines in atheistic kind of like anti-sacred way. I mean they're pursuing more meaning in their life, and people want to increase the sense of meaning and purpose in their life. And this like existential kind of dread that comes from like the nihilism and the meaningless of the modern condition is a big issue that people are always looking to kind of overcome. And in fact, it's an instinct that can't be helped. It like haunts people, and I think the left needs to look at that and not leave that dilemma on the table, and needs to embrace the fact that people want broader, more comprehensive, more complete answers, not just in terms of, again, like their material needs being satisfied and the fruits of their labor, but also like this notion of like autonomy and becoming a complete person, a more divine person, if you will. That I think that's something that the left needs to consider more.
Yeah. And I think the origin of this idea of the atheistic left comes from a few things. So, you have this again, like what I had mentioned in passing before, the reaction to the old conservative order, right? That sense of that liberation mindedness was reacting to a very heavily controlled conservative order steeped in religion, right? So the reaction to that, if you look at what happened in the French Revolution, the first major revolution, you had, look up the Wikipedia article, the dechristianization of France, right? So
Yeah,
there's this inherently anti-clerical kind of sense of breaking free of the old religious order. And this was coming off of a time of, increased focus on the scientific method, on the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, so on and so forth. Now that came with a lot of atheism and materialism, but typically that's been the realm of the left because the right has been kind of more likely to hold on to their Christian values and so forth, at least in the Western sense. Um, and then you have the Marxist discussion of religion as the opiate of the masses, and then so on and so forth. So there's that kind of atheistic perception of the left as well. Um, and there, this idea that what's called this quote unquote Gnostic version of politics, which is this idea of making imminent the final, way of things, the omega point, the eschaton, right? The This idea is that we can bring heaven on earth by optimizing our earthly institutions and systems, which inherently rubs up against the inherent distrust for human systems, and hence the relegation of that to like the spiritual realm, and which you know uh, if it's in the realm of God, then it's not up to us humans to bring heaven on earth. We just need to live our best lives here, and then we'll see him in the afterlife. Versus let's make this heaven, raise hell until it becomes heaven, right?
yeah,
So it's that went in opposition against, again, that classic religious structural that structure that existed before. And you saw as a result, the Soviet Union come as a Marxist state that was atheist, that exemplified that in many people's minds. But it doesn't have to be that way going forward. It just carry over from how things have unfolded historically.
Yeah, a communist state, maybe a socialist state, state capitalist, really. I deign to call it terribly Marxist. It maybe had some underpinning there, but I don't want to give it too much credit. Um, Devin, you had some more thoughts.
Again, just going back to like just the idea that the left has always been rooted in like has always been rooted in a form of spirituality. It's been an alternative form of spirituality. Like, the right has its Christian conservative values and its spirituality and its conception of God as like this like cosmic master, this cosmic monarch of sorts. Like it ties into it just is tied into their political worldview. But like historically, the left has come from like a spiritual conception of God and like the divine order. That's the idea that like everybody has it within them to come in touch with the divine, and it just has a lot of implications, especially political implications. Like, how do you create a society where everyone can get in touch with that like inner divine spark? And that's what a lot of like pre-Marxist left movements kind of developed out of, was just this like spiritual impulse, this alternative conception of God and the divine and like the human being's like relationship to it. Um, so yeah, I mean such a big topic that I'm sure we'll eventually get into it, a little bit. We'll get into it in more detail, but yeah, it's something that I think is very important for the left to get back in touch with in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think we've all kind of spoke really well to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Phoenix, brought up the notion of immanentize the eschaton. That's exactly it. We need to have, we need to conceive of universalism not only materially, but in the meaning space of ideas. That's where I think a lot of strong vision comes from, and that can be very compelling for people. Well, Phoenix, Devin, thank you. That's been a great second episode, and this has been the Wasteland and the Mountain. We are signing off. Thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to our second episode. Please subscribe and join us for future episodes where we dive deeply into the concepts, ideas, great intellects, and thinkers of the class conscious left. Until next time, listeners, thank you.